A billionaire spent 2 years and over $4 million on the best doctors, specialists, and therapists in the world to make his disabled daughter walk. Every single one of them failed. And then one night, he opened his security cameras and saw his housekeeper, the woman he had never even greeted properly, on her knees at 1 a.m. in his living room, holding his daughter's tiny hands as the little girl took her first real steps. She had been doing it every night for weeks. She never told a soul. If this story doesn't move you, nothing will. Hit subscribe right now, drop a comment, and like this video before we begin. Marcus Reed pulled into the driveway of his Charlotte, North Carolina estate at 11:15 p.m. on a Wednesday the way he pulled into it every night. Late, exhausted, with the engine still running for 10 seconds after he parked because turning it off meant going inside, and going inside meant walking past the room at the end of the hallway, the room with the butterfly nightlight and the small purple wheelchair folded next to the bed, the room where his 4-year-old daughter slept every night in a house full of people and not a single one of them was her father. The estate had 7 bedrooms, a home theater nobody used, a pool house that hadn't been opened in 2 years, and a silence that lived in every hallway like a permanent guest who refused to leave. There were 11 staff members, a head nurse, a night nurse, a physical therapist who came 3 times a week, a cook, a gardener, 2 housekeepers, a driver, a personal assistant, and a nanny who read Sophie bedtime stories that Marcus should have been reading himself. The house ran like a machine. Everything was scheduled, managed, paid for. Sophie's meals were prepared by a nutritionist. Her therapy was supervised by a specialist flown in from Johns Hopkins. Her clothes were bought by the nanny who knew her size, her favorite color, her preference for soft fabrics because rough ones irritated her skin. Every single need was met. Every single box was checked. Except one. Sophie didn't have a father. She had a funding source. A man who signed checks, approved treatments, and reviewed medical reports at 2 a.m. from behind a locked office door. A man who had held her exactly once in the delivery room 4 years ago, when the doctors placed her on his chest while her mother's heart monitor flatlined 3 feet away. Her name was Catherine. She was 31. She died on the table while Marcus held their daughter and listened to the sound that would define the rest of his life. A long, unbroken beep that meant the woman he loved was gone, and the child in his arms was all that was left of her. Sophie had Catherine's eyes. The same deep brown, the same shape, the same way they caught light and held it like small windows into something warm. And that was the cruelest part. Because every time Marcus looked at his daughter, he didn't see Sophie. He saw Catherine. He saw the last morning they had together, Catherine standing in the nursery rubbing her belly and laughing about how the baby kicked every time she ate strawberries. He saw the hospital room, the blood, the doctors moving too fast, the silence that came after. So Marcus stopped looking. Not all at once. Not in a single conscious decision. It happened the way most cowardice happens, gradually, invisibly, one avoided glance at a time, one skipped bedtime at a time, one closed office door at a time, until the distance between father and daughter became so wide that neither of them knew how to cross it anymore. Sophie was born with a rare neuromuscular condition. The doctors explained it to Marcus in the hospital 2 days after Catherine died, using words like hypotonia, nerve damage, and limited motor function. They said the muscles in her legs hadn't developed properly. The nerves that were supposed to send signals from her brain to her feet were damaged, misfiring, incomplete. They said she might never walk normally. They said might, because doctors always leave a crack of hope in the door, even when they know the door is sealed shut. Marcus didn't accept it. Acceptance was not something billionaires practiced. He flew in specialists from Boston, New York, Los Angeles. He brought a pediatric neurologist from Germany who charged $40,000 for a 2-day consultation. He hired a physical therapist from a clinic in Switzerland that had published papers on childhood nerve regeneration. He spent $600,000 on an experimental treatment in South Korea that involved stem cell injections and months of rehabilitation. Nothing worked. Sophie went through braces, water therapy, electric stimulation, Exercises that made her scream in pain while therapists held her legs and told her she was doing great. She was 2 years old, sitting in a tiny wheelchair with butterfly stickers on the armrests, looking up at her father with those Catherine eyes, and Marcus felt something crack inside him that no amount of money could repair. He wasn't angry at the doctors. He wasn't angry at the condition. He was angry at himself, because every failed treatment felt like a personal failure, like the universe was telling him that he couldn't save his wife and he couldn't fix his daughter and all his billions were just paper in a burning building. So he did what he had done after Catherine's death. He disappeared. Not physically. Financially, he was more present than ever, approving every bill, funding every new treatment, signing every check. But emotionally, he pulled the blinds down. He stopped going to Sophie's therapy sessions. He stopped carrying her to bed at night. He stopped sitting with her during meals. He hired more staff, more nurses, more specialists, and used them as walls between himself and the pain of watching his daughter struggle. By the time Sophie turned 4, she was the brightest child in a house full of shadows. She talked constantly, asked questions about everything, laughed at her own jokes, and wheeled herself around the house with an independence that amazed every nurse who worked with her. She had adapted to the wheelchair the way children adapt to everything, completely, without self-pity, without understanding that her life was supposed to be different. But there was one thing Sophie did every evening that nobody paid attention to. Every day at 5 p.m., when the neighborhood children played on the street outside the estate, Sophie wheeled herself to the large window in the upstairs hallway and watched. She pressed her small hands against the glass and watched them run, jump, chase each other, fall down, and get up. And her eyes held something that no 4-year-old's eyes should hold: longing. The quiet, heavy longing of a child who understands exactly what she's missing. Grace Delgado arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. She came through the service entrance carrying a small duffel bag and wearing a plain gray t-shirt tucked into black pants. No jewelry, no makeup, hair tied back in a simple ponytail. She was 28 years old, from a small town in rural Tennessee called Dunlap. The kind of town where everyone knows your name and nobody has enough money to leave. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, met her at the door, handed her a uniform, showed her the cleaning schedule, pointed to the supply closet, and said, "Stay out of Mr. Reed's way. Don't speak to him unless spoken to. Don't touch anything in his office. And don't bother the child. The nurses handle her." Grace nodded. "Yes, ma'am." That was the extent of her introduction. No tour of the house, no meeting with Marcus, no introduction to Sophie. She was a maid. Maids cleaned. That was the beginning and the end of her job description. For the first week, Grace was invisible. She mopped floors, scrubbed bathrooms, dusted shelves, polished the kitchen counters until they reflected the ceiling lights. She worked quietly, efficiently, without small talk, without complaint. The other staff barely noticed her. She ate lunch alone in the service kitchen, washed her plate immediately after, and went back to work. But Grace noticed things. She noticed that Marcus's office light was on at midnight and still on at 6 a.m. She noticed that the nurses spoke about Sophie's condition in clinical terms, like she was a case file and not a child. She noticed that the nanny read Sophie bedtime stories with a cheerful voice that sounded rehearsed, professional, like reading to a client rather than a little girl. And she noticed the window. On her third evening, Grace was cleaning the upstairs hallway when she saw Sophie. The little girl had wheeled herself to the large window at the end of the corridor. Her hands were pressed flat against the glass. Her forehead was touching it. And she was watching the children outside play tag on the sidewalk, their laughter faint through the thick glass, distant, like music from a room you aren't allowed to enter. Grace stopped mopping. She stood there, 15 feet away, watching Sophie watch the world. And something moved inside her that she hadn't felt since she left Dunlap. A recognition. The recognition of a child who wants something so badly that her whole body leans toward it, even when she knows she can't have it. Grace knew that feeling. She had grown up with a younger brother named Daniel, who was born deaf. She watched him stand at the edge of playgrounds, watching other kids call each other's names, respond to whistles, laugh at jokes he couldn't hear. She watched him press his hands against speakers at school dances, feeling the vibrations of music he would never actually hear. And she had been the one who learned sign language first, before their parents, before anyone, because she couldn't stand watching her brother live in silence when she had hands that could speak for him. Grace looked at Sophie at that window and saw Daniel. She saw a child on the outside of something, pressing against glass that nobody else was trying to break. She didn't say anything that night. She finished mopping and went to her room. But she didn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about a little girl and a window and the distance between wanting and having. It was 12:47 a.m. on a Thursday night when Grace did something that could have gotten her fired. The house was silent. Marcus was locked in his office on the second floor. The night nurse had checked on Sophie at midnight and returned to the staff quarters. The hallways were dark except for the dim glow of the emergency lights that lined the baseboards. Grace walked barefoot down the corridor to Sophie's room. She opened the door slowly. The butterfly nightlight cast a soft purple glow across the walls. Sophie was asleep, curled on her side, her small body barely making a shape under the blanket, her wheelchair folded and leaning against the wall like a skeleton of the life she lived during the day. Grace knelt beside the bed. She touched Sophie's shoulder gently. "Sophie, wake up, sweetheart." Sophie's eyes opened slowly. She blinked, confused, looking at Grace with the foggy recognition of a child pulled from deep sleep. She had seen Grace around the house, but had never spoken to her. Grace was the lady who mopped the floors. That was all she knew. "Who are you?" Sophie whispered. "My name is Grace. I work here. I clean the house." "Why are you in my room?" Grace paused. She hadn't rehearsed this. She hadn't planned a speech or prepared an explanation that would make sense to a 4-year-old at midnight. She just looked at Sophie and said the only thing that felt true. "Because I think you and me should try something. Just you and me. Can you keep a secret?" Sophie's eyes widened. Children love secrets. It's one of the few forms of power they have in a world controlled entirely by adults. She nodded. Grace picked her up. Sophie was light, lighter than Grace expected, her legs thin and still beneath the pajama pants. Grace carried her through the dark hallway, down the stairs, and into the living room. She set Sophie down gently on the hardwood floor, her bare feet touching the cold surface. Sophie looked up at her, uncertain. "What are we doing?" Grace knelt in front of her. She held out both hands, palms up. "We're going to walk." "I can't walk," the doctors said. The doctors said a lot of things, but they're not here right now. It's just you and me and this room, and I think we should try. Sophie looked at Grace's hands, then at her own legs, then back at Grace's face, searching for something, permission maybe, or belief, or the kind of certainty that adults carry when they truly mean what they say. Whatever she found there, it was enough. Sophie reached out and grabbed Grace's hands. "Ready?" Grace whispered. Sophie nodded. Grace stood up slowly, pulling Sophie's arms upward until the girl was vertical, her weight shifting from Grace's grip to her own feet for the first time without a therapist, without equipment, without a clinical setting. Just a cold floor, a dark room, and 2 hands holding hers. Sophie's legs trembled, her knees buckled, her face twisted with effort and pain. She lasted 2 seconds before her legs gave out and she collapsed forward into Grace's arms. "I fell," Sophie said, her voice cracking. Grace held her. "That's okay. Falling is just walking that isn't finished yet. We try again tomorrow." They tried again the next night, and the night after, and the night after that. Every night at midnight, after the house went dark and the staff retreated to their quarters, Grace walked to Sophie's room, picked her up, and carried her to the living room. Same routine, same darkness, same secret. The first week was brutal. Sophie could barely stand for 3 seconds without collapsing. Her legs shook violently the moment weight was placed on them. The muscles that doctors said were too weak fired in uncontrolled bursts, causing her knees to buckle and her ankles to twist inward. She fell constantly, sometimes forward, sometimes sideways, always into Grace's waiting arms. Some nights, Sophie cried, not the loud, dramatic crying of a child who wants attention, the quiet, exhausted crying of a child in real pain. Her legs ached, her feet burned against the cold floor. Her body was doing something it had never done without medical supervision, and every nerve ending screamed in protest. On those nights, Grace didn't push. She sat on the floor with Sophie in her lap, rubbed her small legs with gentle hands, and sang. Old songs from Dunlap, hymns her grandmother used to sing on the porch while shelling peas, songs with no medical value and no therapeutic purpose except the one thing that mattered most. They made Sophie feel safe enough to try again. "One more?" Grace would whisper after the crying stopped, and Sophie, every single time, would wipe her face and nod. By the end of the second week, Sophie could stand for 10 seconds unassisted. Her legs still trembled, her balance was fragile, but she was vertical and she was holding. Grace stood 3 feet away with her arms open, and Sophie stood between the couch and the coffee table, gripping nothing, holding herself up with muscles that were learning, slowly, painfully, what they were built to do. Then came the steps. The first real step happened on a Tuesday night, 16 days after they started. Grace was kneeling 4 feet away. Sophie was standing by the couch, one hand resting on the armrest. Grace held out her hands and said, "Come to me." Sophie let go of the couch. Her body swayed. Her right foot slid forward, not a lift, but a drag, a scraping sound against the hardwood that echoed in the silent room. Then her left foot. Another drag, then her right again. 3 movements that barely qualified as steps, ugly and uncoordinated and trembling. But she reached Grace. She fell into her arms, and Grace caught her and held her, and Sophie whispered against her shoulder, "I did it." "You did it," Grace said, and her voice broke on the 3rd word because she wasn't a therapist and she wasn't a doctor, and she had no training for this. But she had just watched a child do something the best specialists in the world said might never happen. After that, the progress accelerated. 3 steps became 5. 5 became 8. Grace started placing pillows on the floor as obstacles. She turned it into games. Walk to the lamp and back. Walk to me before I finish counting to 10. She told stories that required Sophie to walk to the next chapter. "The princess can only hear the ending if she walks to the castle," Grace would say, pointing to the far wall, and Sophie would set her jaw and walk. By week 6, Sophie could cross the entire living room, 22 steps, slow, careful, unsteady, but real. Her feet lifted off the ground now instead of dragging, her knees bent properly, her arms swung at her sides for balance. She walked like a child learning to walk for the first time, which is exactly what she was, and nobody knew. Not Marcus, not the nurses, not the therapists, nobody. It was their secret. Midnight and the living room and the sound of small bare feet on hardwood in the dark. Now pay close attention because this is where everything changes. It was a Friday evening. Marcus was in his office reviewing quarterly reports when his phone buzzed. A message from Mrs. Patterson. "Sir, the silver tray set from the dining room is missing. Noticed today during inventory." Marcus frowned. The silver tray set was a wedding gift from Catherine's parents. It was worth about $8,000, but its real value was sentimental, irreplaceable. He opened his laptop and pulled up the security camera system. The house had 26 cameras covering every entrance, hallway, and common area. Marcus rarely checked them. They ran automatically, storing footage on a cloud server that kept recordings for 90 days. He clicked on the dining room camera and started scrubbing through the last week's footage, looking for anyone carrying a tray. Fast-forwarding through hours of empty rooms, staff walking past, lights turning on and off. Nothing unusual. He switched to the living room camera to check a different angle, started scrubbing. Daytime footage showed the usual activity. Nurses with Sophie, the nanny reading, housekeepers cleaning. He fast-forwarded through the evening hours: 9 p.m., empty room; 10 p.m., empty; 11 p.m., dark; midnight, still dark. Then, at 12:43 a.m., a light turned on. Marcus slowed the playback. The living room appeared on screen in dim yellow light from a single table lamp. A figure walked in carrying something. He leaned closer to the screen. It was Grace, the new maid, and she was carrying Sophie. Marcus's hand froze on the mouse. His first thought was alarm. Why was a housekeeper carrying his daughter at midnight? His second thought was anger. Mrs. Patterson had specifically told all staff not to handle Sophie without medical supervision. But then Grace set Sophie down on the floor and knelt in front of her and held out her hands, and Sophie grabbed them and pulled herself up. Marcus stopped breathing. Sophie was standing. Not in a therapy room, not in a medical harness, not with a doctor monitoring her vitals, standing in the middle of his living room at 1 a.m. with only a housekeeper's hands keeping her steady. Then Grace let go. She moved back 2 feet and held her arms open, and Sophie stepped forward. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Her legs wobbled, her arms flailed for balance, but she walked. She walked 3 steps and fell into Grace's arms, and Marcus could see, even through the grainy security footage, that both of them were smiling. He rewound the footage, went back one day, same scene, 12:45 a.m., Grace carrying Sophie, walking practice, went back another day, same thing, another day, same. He went back 3 weeks and found the first recording, Grace on her knees, Sophie standing for barely 2 seconds before collapsing. Marcus clicked through the footage night after night, watching his daughter's progress in fast forward like a time lapse of a miracle. From collapsing instantly to standing for seconds, to taking 1 step, to 3, to 5, to crossing half the room. 6 weeks of midnight sessions, 42 nights, and not once, not a single time, did Grace look at a camera, tell another staff member, or leave any evidence that this was happening. She did it in complete silence, complete secrecy, for no reward. Marcus pushed back from his desk. His hands were shaking, his vision blurred, and for the first time in 2 years, Marcus Reed, the man who had locked himself behind a door to avoid his own daughter, put his face in his hands and wept. He watched every recording, all of them. 42 nights compressed into 3 hours of footage that Marcus consumed without moving from his chair, without drinking water, without checking his phone, without doing anything except watching a housekeeper and his daughter perform a miracle in his living room while he slept upstairs behind a locked door. He saw the first night, Grace carrying Sophie in, setting her down, the girl's confused face. He saw Grace kneel and hold out her hands and say words he couldn't hear because the cameras had no audio. But he could read the body language, the patience, the gentleness, the way Grace never rushed, never pulled, never forced. He saw the falls, dozens of them. Sophie collapsing forward, sideways, backward. Every fall caught by Grace's arms. Every single one. Not once did Sophie hit the floor. Grace was always there, always positioned, always ready. He saw the nights Sophie cried. He could tell by the way her shoulders shook and her head dropped and her hands covered her face, and he watched Grace sit on the floor and pull Sophie into her lap and hold her. No clipboard, no assessment, no documenting the session, just holding a child who was hurting. He saw the first real step, the way Sophie let go of the couch and slid her foot forward, the way Grace's hands flew to her mouth, the way Sophie fell into Grace's arms, and Grace held her with her eyes closed and her face pressed against Sophie's hair, and Marcus could see, even through the low-resolution footage, that Grace was crying too. He saw the progress, steps getting longer, steadier, Sophie's confidence building, the way she started walking with her chin up instead of staring at her feet, the way she started smiling before she took the first step, like she already knew she could do it. And then Marcus saw something that broke him in a way nothing else had. It was footage from 2 weeks ago. Sophie had just walked 8 steps to Grace. She was standing in Grace's arms, catching her breath, and she looked up at Grace and said something. Marcus couldn't read her lips from the camera angle, but Grace's reaction told him everything. Grace's face crumbled, her eyes closed. She pulled Sophie close and held her with both arms and rocked her slowly. Marcus stared at the screen. He would never know what Sophie said that night, but he knew what it looked like. It looked like a child saying something that mattered, something that came from the deepest place a 4-year-old has, and it had been said not to her father, not to her nurse, not to any of the people being paid to care for her, but to a housekeeper who cleaned floors for a living and spent her nights teaching a stranger's daughter to walk. Marcus closed the laptop. He sat in the dark office for 11 minutes. The house was silent. It was 11:30 p.m. He knew the schedule now. In approximately 1 hour, Grace would walk to Sophie's room, pick her up, and carry her downstairs. He stood up from his chair. He opened his office door for the first time before midnight in 2 years. And he walked downstairs. Marcus sat in the dark living room and waited. He didn't turn on any lights. He sat in the armchair in the corner, the one facing the center of the room, and he waited with his hands folded and his heart beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. At 12:41 a.m., he heard the soft padding of bare feet on the hallway floor above, a door opening, the faint sound of whispered words he couldn't make out. Then footsteps on the stairs, slow and careful, one person carrying another. Grace appeared in the living room doorway. Sophie was in her arms, awake, her small hands around Grace's neck. Grace walked to the center of the room and set Sophie down on the floor the way she had done 42 times before. Then she reached for the lamp. The light clicked on, and Grace saw Marcus sitting in the armchair. She froze. Every muscle in her body locked. Her face went white. Her hands, which had been reaching for Sophie, stopped in midair. "Mr. Reed?" Her voice came out broken, terrified. The voice of a woman who has been caught doing something she knows could end everything. "Sir, I can explain. I wasn't trying to... I didn't mean to go against..." "How long?" Marcus said. His voice was quiet, not angry, not cold, something else entirely. Grace swallowed. 6 weeks, sir." "Every night?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" Grace looked at him, then at Sophie, who was sitting on the floor looking between the two adults with the confused awareness of a child who senses that something important is happening but doesn't understand what. "Because she watches them, sir. The children outside. Every day at 5 p.m. she wheels herself to that window and watches them run. And her face..." Grace's voice cracked. She pressed her lips together, steadied herself. "Her face looks like she's standing outside a door that everyone else gets to walk through, and I just couldn't watch her sit at that window one more time without trying." Marcus stared at her. This woman who earned less than anyone in his house, who had no medical degree, no therapy certification, no authorization to touch his daughter, who had risked her job, her only source of income, every single night for 6 weeks because she saw a child at a window and couldn't look away. "Show me," Marcus whispered. Grace blinked. "Sir? Show me what she can do." Grace looked at Sophie. She knelt down, held out her hands the way she had done every night, and said softly, "Sophie, can you show your papa what we've been practicing?" Sophie looked at Grace. Then she turned her head and looked at her father, sitting in the armchair, leaning forward, his eyes red and his jaw tight, and his hands gripping the armrests like the chair was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. "Papa," Sophie said, "watch me." She grabbed Grace's hands and pulled herself up. Grace held her steady for a moment, then slowly released her fingers. Sophie stood alone. Her legs trembled. Her arms went out to the sides for balance. Then she took a step, and another, and another. 3 steps toward the armchair where her father sat. 3 steps that covered 6 feet of hardwood floor, but crossed a distance that had taken 2 years to close. Sophie reached her father. She put her small hands on his knees and looked up at him with Catherine's eyes and said 5 words that dismantled every wall Marcus had built around his heart. "Papa, look, I can walk." Marcus slid off the chair onto his knees. He pulled Sophie into his arms and held her against his chest so tightly that Grace almost stepped forward to tell him to be gentle. But she didn't, because this wasn't a medical moment. This was a father holding his daughter for the first time in 2 years, really holding her, not carrying her to a therapist, or placing her in a wheelchair, but holding her the way fathers are supposed to hold their children, like they're the most important thing in the world. Marcus looked up at Grace through tears that ran openly down his face. He didn't speak. He couldn't, but his eyes said everything. "Thank you. I'm sorry. How did you do what I couldn't?" Grace stood in the dim living room with her hands clasped in front of her, tears falling silently down her own cheeks, and she didn't need words either. The scene in front of her was enough. A father and his daughter on the floor, together for the first time in a lifetime. Everything changed after that night. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way. In the slow, steady way that things change when someone finally opens a door they've kept locked for years. Marcus started coming out of his office. Not all at once. The first morning after the living room, he came downstairs at 7:30 a.m. and sat at the breakfast table while Sophie ate her oatmeal. He didn't say much. Sophie didn't say much either. They sat together in a silence that wasn't comfortable yet but was no longer hostile. It was the silence of two people relearning each other's presence. The second morning, he poured her juice. The third morning, he cut her toast into triangles because the nanny mentioned that's how Sophie liked it. By the end of the first week, Marcus was having breakfast with his daughter every morning, and the staff moved through the kitchen with the careful quiet of people who understood that something fragile and important was happening and they shouldn't disturb it. Marcus didn't stop the midnight sessions. He joined them. Every night at 12:30, he came downstairs and sat in the armchair and watched Grace work with Sophie. He saw the games, the songs, the stories. He saw the way Grace turned physical therapy into play, how she made pain feel like adventure and failure feel like practice. He saw things no expensive specialist had ever thought to try because specialists follow protocols and Grace followed instinct. After 2 weeks, Marcus asked Grace if he could help. She showed him how to hold Sophie's hands, how to position himself at the right distance, how to let go gradually so Sophie didn't feel the support disappear all at once. She taught him the songs, she taught him the counting games, she taught him how to catch Sophie when she fell, without making her feel like falling was a failure. And something happened during those midnight sessions that neither Marcus nor Grace expected. A connection formed, not between father and daughter, though that was healing too, between Marcus and Grace. In the quiet living room at 1 a.m., with a 4-year-old walking between them, they talked. Grace told Marcus about growing up in Dunlap, about Daniel, about learning sign language, about leaving Tennessee with $300 and a bus ticket. Marcus told Grace about Catherine. For the first time in 4 years, he said her name out loud to someone and didn't feel like the word would kill him. 3 months after that night, Marcus walked into the kitchen on a Saturday morning and made an announcement to Mrs. Patterson in front of the entire staff. Grace is no longer a housekeeper in this house. Her title is Household Family Coordinator. Her salary is tripled effective immediately. She reports directly to me. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can collect their severance from my assistant. Nobody had a problem with it. Grace moved from the small staff bedroom on the ground floor to the guest suite on the second floor, 20 feet from Sophie's room. She continued the midnight sessions, but now they happened at 7 p.m. in the open, with lights on and Marcus sitting on the floor beside them. Sophie's progress accelerated. She started walking outside, in the garden, on the grass, on the driveway. She fell less. She walked farther. She started running, a clumsy, unsteady, beautiful run that looked like a baby deer discovering legs for the first time. The wheelchair stayed in Sophie's room. Then it moved to the hallway closet. Then to the garage. Then it was gone, donated to a children's hospital downtown. Sophie didn't need it anymore. A year passed. Sophie was 5 now. She walked to kindergarten on her own 2 feet, holding Marcus's hand on the left and Grace's hand on the right. Her legs weren't perfect, they would never be perfect. She had a slight limp on her left side, and she tired faster than other children, and on cold mornings her muscles stiffened and she needed extra time to warm up. But she walked, she ran, she jumped. She danced in the living room to songs Grace played on her phone while Marcus sat on the couch and watched with the face of a man who still couldn't believe what he was seeing. Grace had become the center of the household, not through ambition or strategy, but through the simple gravity of being irreplaceable. She managed Sophie's daily routine, worked with the physical therapist on continued exercises, coordinated with Sophie's teachers, and somehow still found time to keep the kitchen stocked with the banana muffins Sophie demanded every Sunday morning. Marcus had changed in ways the staff whispered about when he wasn't around. He smiled now. He ate meals at the table. He left his office door open. He attended every school event, every therapy session, every doctor's appointment. He was the father he should have been from the beginning, and he knew, with a certainty that lived in his bones, that he owed that transformation to one person. It happened on a Sunday evening. Sophie was asleep. Marcus and Grace were in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner. A dinner Marcus had cooked himself because Grace had taught him how to make spaghetti and he had practiced until he got it right. Grace was drying a plate. Marcus was standing 3 feet away, leaning against the counter, watching her the way he had been watching her for months, with an expression that was impossible to misread. "Grace," she looked up. "Yes? I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without arguing." Grace put the plate down. She turned to face him, her hands folded, her eyes steady. "You saved my daughter. You know that. But you also saved me. Before you came into this house, I was a dead man who happened to be breathing. I hid from my own child because I was too afraid to face what I'd lost. And you, without permission, without a plan, without anyone asking you to, you walked into my daughter's room at midnight and gave her something I couldn't give her with all my money. You gave her a chance." Grace's eyes were filling. She shook her head slightly. "I just did what anyone would. Nobody did. That's the point. I hired the best doctors in the world, and not one of them thought to hold her hands at midnight and say, 'Let's try.' You did. And I'm standing here in this kitchen telling you that somewhere between those midnight sessions and Sunday morning muffins and spaghetti dinners, I fell in love with you. And I think you know that." Grace pressed her hand against her mouth. Tears ran through her fingers. She didn't speak for 10 seconds. That felt like 10 years. "I'm just the maid, Marcus." "You were never just the maid. Not from the first night you carried my daughter downstairs. Not from the first step she took holding your hands. You were the answer to a prayer I didn't even know I was praying." Grace stepped forward. Marcus stepped forward. They met in the middle of the kitchen, and he kissed her, and she kissed him back, and the kitchen light hummed above them, and the house was quiet, and somewhere upstairs a little girl slept in a bed with a butterfly nightlight. A little girl who had no wheelchair, no limitations, and 2 people downstairs who loved her enough to rebuild a life around her. They married 4 months later. A small ceremony in the backyard garden. Sophie walked down the aisle carrying flowers, one careful step at a time, her slight limp visible, but her smile so wide it made every guest cry. Marcus stood at the altar with tears already falling before Sophie reached him. Grace wore a simple white dress, no designer label, no expensive fabric, just Grace. Years later, Marcus sat in that same living room on a winter evening. Sophie, now 12, was doing homework at the dining table. She walked to the kitchen to get water, walked back, sat down, crossed her legs under the chair, the most ordinary movements in the world, movements that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know the story. Grace sat beside Marcus on the couch, her head on his shoulder, watching their daughter. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Marcus said. "What?" "The security cameras. If that silver tray hadn't gone missing, I never would have checked the footage. I never would have seen you." Grace smiled. "You would have found out eventually. Sophie was getting too good at walking to keep it a secret much longer. Marcus shook his head. I don't mean the walking. I mean you. I never would have seen you. You were invisible in this house, Grace. You cleaned and cooked and nobody looked at you. And the whole time, while nobody was looking, you were performing a miracle. Grace took his hand. I wasn't performing anything. I just saw a little girl at a window who wanted to walk. And I thought, if nobody else is going to help her, then I will. Marcus kissed her forehead. Sophie looked up from her homework. You guys are being weird again, she said, and went back to her math. The house was warm, the living room was full, and somewhere in the cloud server of an old security system, 42 recordings still existed. 42 nights of a maid and a little girl in a dark room, holding hands, taking steps, falling down, getting up, trying again, building a miracle out of nothing but patience and love, and the stubborn refusal to accept that some things are impossible. And if this story touched something inside you, if you believe that love isn't about money or status, but about showing up when nobody's watching, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that miracles don't always come from hospitals and doctors. Sometimes they come from the most unexpected person in the room. Leave a comment telling me what moment broke you the most, and I'll see you in the next one.